In this video, we'll read about Walt Whitman's visit to a synagogue and what it can tell us about how non-Jewish Americans thought about Jews in the mid-1800s. Hi, I'm David. Welcome to Affiliated Identities, an introduction to Jewish American literature. For most of the 19th century, there weren't too many Jews in the US. That did not mean that American writers did not have opinions about them. The most famous literary response was Longfellow's The Jewish Graveyard at Newport, which I discussed in another video. But it was not the only response. Walt Whitman wrote a short report that tells us a lot about how some Americans thought about Jews even before the wave of immigrations of the 1880s. Julian Levinson, a scholar of Jewish literature, calls this approach the theory of the two Jews, as Levinson writes. Even while symbolizing spiritual backwardness, Jews were also imagined as representing a direct link to the heroic biblical past, the very past that functioned symbolically as the paradigm for the settlement of America. The figure of the Jew could be seen, therefore, as at once a debased creature and a strangely evocative relic from the ancient past. To paraphrase the point with some license, some Gentiles had a hard time squaring their thinking of Jews as a majestic ancient race associated with their most sacred stories, with the Jews they saw as lowly foreigners who also rejected the Christian belief. So they separate the Jew into two categories: Hebrews who could be respected and Jews who deserved little positive attention. This distinction also had a class dimension. Well-off Jews could be accepted, while poor Jews deserved disrespect. Levinson uses the articles Whitman wrote in 1842 to illustrate this duality. I will now read the two short articles with you to illustrate the same idea and comment as I go along. I won't introduce Whitman, there are many resources about him online. You should know that this is early in his adult life when he was working as the editor of a newspaper. I take the text from the Whitman archive, where they state that while the text is not signed, there are a number of good reasons to believe that he wrote it. A peep at the Israelites. For the first time in our life, we as in the editorial team of the paper, but it's also like a really first person account. On Saturday morning last, the Jewish day of rest and worship, to spend an hour in a Jewish synagogue, the Jewish place of worship, accompanied by a friend, and starting at 10 o'clock, we wended our way through Center Street, from thence into Crosby, in which a block or two above ground we found the place of our destination. The front to the street was bordered by a high fence with a banister work on the top. Passing through a gate and down 2 or 3 rods by the side of the building, we went up the steps of the porch in the rear, where we found the entrance. This is one of the oldest synagogues in the US, set up by immigrants from Germany. Fearful lest we should go somewhere or do something that might be totally malapropos, inappropriate, is feeling out of place. We waited a few moments until, seeing a gentleman enter, followed him through a side door into the main body of the house. There we were politely ushered to a convenient seat, from whence we had a fair view of all the performances. The whole scene was entirely new. Never had we beheld anything of a similar description before, emphasizing the strangeness and exoticism of the event. The congregation, we don't know what other word to use, were all standing, each one with his hat on. The non Jewish custom would be probably to take off your hat in a house of worship, but head coverings are part of the Jewish ritual. A white silken mantle, somewhat like a scarf, was worn by every person. That's a talit or prayer shawl. It encircled the neck, falling down the back, and the ends in front reaching to the floor. In the middle of the room was a raised platform about 4 yards square with a heavy balustrade of bronze work and mahogany around it. Upon the center of this platform was a figure which, by the voice coming from it, we knew to be a man. None of the lineaments of the human form, however, were visible, for one of the large silk mantles alluded to was thrown over his head and completely shrouded him. This is part of the common practice in Jewish worship, but I think Whitman here is also emphasizing how shrouded in mystery the entire event is, just as the man is shrouded with the prayer shawl. He was speaking, but as his language was Hebrew, we could not understand a word he uttered. The language barrier is emphasized here. At the further end of the room stood an erection very much resembling the front that pictures give the ancient Parthenon. This is a cabinet for the Holy Scriptures that is very common in Jewish synagogues. He compares it to ancient Greece remnants. And under it was a semicircular partitioned enclosure of paneled wood, which from the ornaments and expensive tracery lavished upon the whole affair seemed intended to contain something either very valuable or very sacred. It contains Torah scrolls, which are both sacred and expensive. Upon the platform, which made part of this structure, there was another figure standing, half shrouded in a white mantle, like the personage before described. He was also speaking. And there we were, amid the Jews worshipping in their temple, no longer synagogue but temple like in ancient times. The people of Solomon and Saul, of Ruth and Mary Magdalene, of the traitor Judas and John, and the beloved of the Son of God, the people, the very Christ himself. These were they who stood around. Here he sees the Jews as representing characters from the Bible. It's interesting that he mentions both anti-Semitic figure of Judas and Jesus Christ himself, of whom Christians rarely think of as Jewish. Now, as we read this, think how strange it is, how strange of Whitman it is that he sees a group of modern people and thinks of them as part of the 3,000-year-old Bible. And they were speaking in the same tones as those which at night bade the shepherd to follow the guidance of the star in the east. The same tones which Jonathan and Saul used in their beautiful friendship, which sounded out from the plaintive Hagar in the wilderness, through which Absalom, the too beauteous boy, made rebellion against his father, with which the widow's son, who was dead and brought to life again, gladdened his desolate mother's heart. The tones and the native language of the holy psalmist, the lovely Rebecca of Scott, and the malignant Shylock of Shakespeare. There is a series of biblical and literary references here which I would take too long to unpack. The last two are allusions to Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe and Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, two works that trade in anti-Semitic stereotypes even if some of their Jewish characters can be seen as positive. The point of all these references is to make a connection between the language used in the prayer and ancient and medieval Jews, Again, the Jews he sees in the modern world are thought of as relics of olden times. And here was a remnant of the mighty nation who routed the warlike dwellers in Canaan, the original name of the land of Israel, and who received the law from the great I am. The great I am is God. One of the ways of explaining the word Jehovah is I am in Hebrew. Upon the mountain of clouds, their ancient pride swept in the winds, their name a jeering and mark of contempt, once a great and proud nation, now scorned and hated, their might humbled, their old homes taken by the hand of the spoiler, and clouds and dark frowns for ages spread around them. Yet here, scoffed, scouted, and scorned, they came to worship their God after the manner of their ancestors. Amazingly, they insist still being here. Is he impressed or annoyed? I will let you decide. Again, we see the double image of the Jews as an ancient, magnificent people and as a contemporary people who get a lot of scorn and hatred and maybe deserve it. The heart within us felt odd as in the presence of memorials from an age that had passed away centuries and centuries ago. The strange and discordant tongue, the mystery, and all the associations that crowded themselves in troops upon our mind made a thrilling sensation to creep through every nerve. It was indeed a sight well calculated to impress the mind with an unwonted, unusual tone. As our account has already stretched to the limits beyond which it is not judicious to go in a paper like ours, we shall give the remainder of what we saw during our stay at the synagogue in the aurora of tomorrow. Doings at the synagogue. We continue our account of what we saw on Saturday during our visit to the Jews' synagogue in Crosby Street. It may perhaps be well to say here that as we had no one to explain to us what we saw, and as the whole scene from beginning to end resembled nothing that we had ever seen before, our relation professes to give merely the scene as it appears to the eyes of an utter stranger. The reporter presents himself as a stranger, someone so alien as to not even have access to a guide or translator. Of course, in presenting himself as a stranger to the synagogue, he's really emphasizing that the Jews here are the strangers, are the strange ones. Very likely we may make some awkward blunders, but nevertheless the reader shall have our first impressions. After the performance had continued for some time, as we described it in yesterday's Aurora, that's the name of the newspaper, some of the Jews went up to the semicircular panel work before mentioned, unlocked it, and opened the doors. 3 or 4 of them then took from the enclosure certain contrivances, which we dare hardly pretend to describe for fear of bungling in the attempt. It would look something like this. As near as we can now recollect, they resembled in shape large sugar loaves, as each had an ornamental and fantastic affair made of silver and glass upon its top. These were brought up to the platform in the center, and each of the silver ornaments we have described was taken from the top of the sugar loaf structure and put upon the desk in the front. The priest, Jews don't have priests. Whitman may be thinking of the Catholic term, or maybe he's thinking of the priest in the temple that does no longer exist. What I saw was a cantor, a singer of prayers, or some other prayer leader. Then raised aloft a large scroll of parchment, probably the sacred law, wafting it around so that the people could see it in all parts of the house. He's correct. This is the Torah. As this while he uttered a kind of chant to which the men and women made responses. We saw Noah of the Sessions Court among the Jews present. Noah was one of the most successful Jews in the 19th century US. He officiated upon the platform in some of the ceremonies. The main floor on which we were was occupied exclusively by men. There was a gallery over it filled with women, dark-eyed Jewesses. Jewess is an archaic word for Jewish woman. He sees Jewish women as dark, exotic, and mysterious. Most of them dressed in black, and a few strangers attracted there probably by curiosity. Indeed, most Orthodox synagogues have a different area or floor dedicated for women, sometimes justified by preventing the men from losing their focus on the ritual. Today, many see this separation as sexist. The spectacle in the gallery was by no means the most unpleasing sight in the whole proceeding. Up aloft, they seemed to pay as reverent heed to the exercises as in any part of the congregation. So the women just pay as much attention as the men. We found ourselves casting our glances thither quite frequently. Perhaps this may account for our not having a distinct recollection of the whole matter. He's basically saying that he lost focus on the ceremony because he was checking out the Jewish women, which I find kind of funny. The personage who appeared to officiate as the high priest continued his chant, and the people their responses. Every now and then, while the parchment scroll was upon the desk and unrolled before the priest, individuals from the congregation would step forward and upon the platform and speak to the priest. Then, while they stood by and looked on, he would read them something from the parchment spread out upon the desk. For 5 minutes, perhaps, this would last, and then another person would come up and go through the same ceremony. They are blessing and reading from the Torah or Decalogue, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible that have a higher status than the rest of the Hebrew Bible. And they are the center of Saturday morning worship. Of course, to our perceptions, the whole affair had much the aspect of an unintelligible mummery. Mummery means nonsense, especially in religious context. He does not get what's going on, and it seems silly to him. Still, we could not divest ourselves of the thought that we were amid the people of ancient Jewry, the people who had kept themselves apart from the contagion of the world and adhered strictly to the customs and observances and laws of their forefathers. Once or twice we allowed fancy, imagination, to have its unchecked flow without stop. The then and there scene vanished from our eyes. The uncouth jabber and the fantastic garb of the worshippers were heard and seen no more. He escapes from the foreign unpleasant present of the synagogue into a fantasy of the past. In his fantasy, we were in the holy city, Jerusalem, the palaces of the haughty nobles, the magnificent temple which the Jews loved as the apple of their eye. The streets and the houses and the public places, all were there. And along the public thoroughfare came trailing a solemn group. In the center was a pale being with a crown of thorn, Jesus, bound round his forehead, and blood trickling down his brow. It was the Holy Savior of man, bearing the cross upon his shoulder, on his way to being crucified, the central story of the Christian faith. And as he passed, the mob scouted and reviled him. His very friends thought it scorn to recognize him, all but one, a woman who followed him even to the place of his crucifixion. We did not wait to see the conclusion of the exercises. After a stay of more than an hour, feeling somewhat wearied by the continents of vocal utterance, not words but just sounds, which we could not take the meaning of, we left the place. Whitman here is quite accepting of the Jews even as he sees them as strange and reminds us that many have despised them in the past. Still, at the same time as he looks at contemporary Jews, his mind escapes again and again to the distant past, till at the end he has a vision of a story that does not belong to the Jews, the crucifixion of Christ. The contradiction between these two poles, real Jews, real living Jews who perform this strange ceremony, and the Jews of the ancient world, is not resolved in these two texts. Rather, Whitman lives to continue with his day. These two short reports I read with you can help illustrate these two ideas of the Jews in American culture. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. Thank you for listening.